Since the early 1700s, Louisiana has produced sugarcane. This production was possible through enslaved African strenuous labor. Once freed after the American Civil War, these Louisiana sugarcane workers remained, but still experienced slave-like conditions. In 1887, the Knights of Labor organized sugar strikes, where black workers struck for better pay. The sugar strikes resulted in the Thibodaux Massacre, a conflict in which white vigilantes killed up to 60 workers. The Thibodaux Massacre was one of the many violent incidents that contributed to the unfair compromise of the low-wage economy and limited union growth in the South today. The establishment of slavery in the South led to the barbarity shown at the Thibodaux Massacre conflict. In 1701, French explorer Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne brought sugarcane with him to Louisiana. Being a labor-intensive crop, strenuous, cheap labor was required. When France refused Moyne's request for slaves from West Africa, he traded his Chitimacha Indian slaves from the Mississippi River Valley for black slaves from the Caribbean. Slavery became an important economic source of labor. By 1859, in the Thibodaux region, 21,276 slaves produced 350,000 hogsheads or barrels of sugar annually. Former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass described Louisiana's sugar country as a life of living death. Slaves were hunched over planting seeds by hand, and as the stalks grew, used heavy cane knives to remove weeds. Workers processed sugarcane into molasses and sugar. Poor conditions caused tragic deaths from workers, stumbling while operating the boiler, being scorched from juices, and losing arms in the cane crushers. Slave John Moore shared, "If they don't do they work, they buck them down and whip them. They tie their hands and feet together and make them put their hands tween the knees, and put a long stick tween the hands so they can't pull them out, and then they whip them in good fashion." In the radical Reconstruction era following the Civil War, black and white Southerners struggled to build a new society, but ultimately whites prevailed. In the reconstructed South, black Americans were still taken advantage of. Southern planters' views of slaves in the same context as cattle did not change during Reconstruction. Covert societies like the Knights of White Camellia, White League, and the Ku Klux Klan threatened Louisiana freedmen. From 1882 to 1936, at least 333 lynchings of black men occurred in Louisiana. By 1877, Reconstruction ended, and the Compromise of 1877 occurred, which put President Hayes in office and removed federal troops from the South. The civil rights freed blacks had attained through the Civil War were not fulfilled because of white rule in the Southern states. In slave-like conditions, at least 10,000 workers on sugar plantations were paid 65 cents per day. Monthly, each worker received about $13 in pasteboard tickets to be used at the plantation store for food and necessities that had been marked up 100%. The Thibodaux sugar strikes and resulting Thibodaux Massacre conflict were organized by the Knights of Labor, or KOL. The Knights of Labor, beginning in 1896, were originally a secret society of tailors devoted to the laboring classes. Under Terence Patterly's leadership, establishing an 8-hour workday and an improvement working conditions were priorities to the Knights of Labor while renouncing violence. The New Orleans Times-Picayune states on March 19, 1880, describing a strike for better pay. It appears that a number of Negroes organized themselves into bands and went to every plantation in the neighborhood, endeavoring to make the strike a general one. When a laborer refused to join them and quit work in the fields, he was immediately attacked with sticks and canes and badly beaten. Once again, in 1885, black Louisiana sugarcane workers struck for better pay with help from the Knights of Labor, which demanded that the Louisiana Sugar Planters Association, or LSPA, pay laborers $1.25 each day, change pay from pasteboard tickets to cash, and pay extra for night work. These demands seemed highly unreasonable to the LSPA, which rebuffed the KOL's request. Therefore, 10,000 plantation workers in Louisiana walked off their job, claiming they would not return until their needs were met. According to author John DeSantis,
it was an amazing event because the idea of people who had only been emancipated for 20-some-odd years in 3 separate jurisdictions organizing to the point where, on the appointed date, everybody laid down their tools and would not work is amazing. I don't know that you could do that today.
The timing could not have been worse for plantation owners who were just beginning the harvest. The sugar strikes led to the Thibodaux Massacre on November 23 of 1887. The Louisiana State Militia was brought in to maintain order. but according to the Knights of Labor, was being used by the planters to control the strikers, as the militia was used to move strikers out of their homes on the plantations. After 2 weeks, the militia's role declined, and white landowners took over the fight against strikers. Kalina Blox's militia and white citizens started firing on men and women who participated in the strikes. As he was angry at the sight of black and white workers on strike together, he said, "God Almighty has himself drawn the color line." According to survivor Jack Conrad, "I think there were about 50 or 60 men in the crowd, which was comprised entirely of white citizens who lived in and around Thibodaux." Conrad said, "When I opened the door, one of the mob said, 'Crack down on him,' and at that, they went to shooting." Jack, his son Grant, and brother-in-law Marcelin were told to line up, and they began to run. Grant was gunned down behind a water barrel, Marcelin Weldon was shot as he ran in another direction, and Jack himself took cover under his house as the gunmen continued shooting, leaving to go to another house after they presumed him dead. There were wails of women, shouts of men, and the unceasing cries of babies as more shots were fired. At the conclusion of the Thibodaux Massacre, up to 60 people were dead, and the bodies were disposed of in an unmarked and still today unfound grave. Ellen Baker Bell suggests that what began as a disagreement over wages became an expression of racial tensions that had been building since the dissolution of slavery. Immediately after the massacre, the surviving laborers who struck returned to work. No immediate compromise was made. Working conditions did not improve. The New Orleans Knights of Labor suggested an investigation of the entire affair, but no investigation took place. Although the Thibodaux Massacre did make it into the U.S. Congressional Record, acknowledging that it did occur, no further actions were taken by the government to solve this inhumanity. The slave-like conditions for workers on sugar plantations prevailed. The Fair Labor Standard Act of 1938 was passed, which created minimum wage and the 40-hour workweek with overtime pay. However, before the enactment of the law, the South argued to the Department of Labor that a 25-cent minimum wage would mean firing all their workers. John McClellan, an Arkansas representative, rhetorically asked, "What profiteth the labor of the South if he gain the enactment of a wage and hour law, 40 cents per hour and 40 hours per week, if he then loses the opportunity to work?" As the Thibodaux Massacre ended, the industrial era was beginning, and fewer laborers were needed in the Louisiana sugar fields and processing plants. Today, sugar is planted and harvested with tractors. 2 huge mechanized processing plants process all the sugar for the state of Louisiana. Since the Thibodaux Massacre conflict, no significant compromise was created that made black labor conditions equal to white workers in the South, especially in Louisiana. According to Harold Myerson, the South's aversion to both minimum wage standards and unions is rooted deep within the DNA of white Southern elite, whose primary impulse has always been to keep African Americans down. A 2015 estimate put the per capita income rate in Louisiana at $35,000 annually for whites and $15,000 annually for blacks. The Thibodaux Massacre conflict contributed to the limited growth of unions in the South. The Center for Economic and Policy Research states that in Louisiana, in 1983, the percentage of the workers in unions was 18.1%, and by 2008 had decreased to 5.6%. According to Harold Myerson, due to the South's low-wage economy and cheap labor, in 2012, General Electric reshored its production of refrigerators and water heaters from Mexico and China to its Appliance Park factories in Kentucky. In addition to General Electric, companies across the globe such as Apple, Boeing, Starbucks, Lenovo, Jeld-Wen, Mercedes-Benz, Honda, Toyota, and Hyundai have all expanded their companies to the southern states because of cheap labor. Michelle V. Rafter acknowledges that today, however, even Chinese companies are building factories in the southeast, ducking rising labor costs at home. In conclusion, the Thibodaux Massacre is an unresolved and enduring conflict with no significant compromise made to create equal labor conditions between black and white workers, contributing to a low-wage economy and the limited growth of unions. Historians have agreed, including John DeSantis, that besides the sugar strikes and barbaric massacre, many violent conflicts have added to the South's poor economy. Thus, the Thibodaux Massacre conflict was one of the many acts of violence that continued the division between laborers and property owners that is shown in the current low-wage economy and limited use of unions in the southern states.
Jack Conrad is the name they gave when I was born a baby slave. Sugar cane was big and tall, I cut it down with mighty blows. Then came war, all the white men